wanted to let you and that Loren kindly offered to let us record this. Uh, Loren is certainly one of the major figures in the whole Pacific coast, actually, up and coming and doing some amazing research. And we're really lucky to have him present his work at Cooper's Ferry in Western Idaho. He certainly is interested in the archaeology of the Americas um, and the lower Snake River uh, Canyon. He also has worked a lot in the Great Basin, like I mentioned, involved with Paisley Cave. We've heard from Dennis Jenkins and John Blong on this. Whoops. I kind of went one slide up. How did that work? Okay. Anyway, and like I say, he's worked on the Oregon coast, which because of the sea level rise, there's not going to always be a lot to be seen there. But he's worked there, and he's also worked on the Pacific coast and in Baja, working on some very old sites. So the whole Pacific coast is really a lot of what he's worked on, and he has involved his students quite a bit. In like the Willamette Valley. He has a class I particularly like, which is Anthro 199, which is Expedition OSU Mammoth Quest, where he and his students are looking through the Willamette Valley for evidence of mammoths. And as you may know, we've worked on that with dating mammoths, getting grants and dating mammoths from museums. And unfortunately, this is sad news, but we've lost one of our longtime members who's given a lot of presentations with us. And actually gave the first presentation right after we started on his work on Marm's Rock Shelter. That's Dr. David Rice. We lost him a few weeks ago after a long illness. He also took members like some of you here, Vic Casser, to Eastern Washington to visit sites there. And was one of the last in-person talks we had at the Mountaineers in Seattle, where he talked about his work on First Peoples and how Eastern Washington is represented in that work. Here he is at the Cowlitz Museum with Jim Chatters. I'm having trouble with my thing here, but like I say, we got grants from the first 1% funds from the Squaxin Island tribe is preparing a museum exhibit on these mammoth bones. And Jim Chatters and David are working. They're archaeologists and got dates from this mammoth bone of 18,000 years ago. And we have some teeth that are coming in around 15,000 in the Chehalis drainage. Like I say, David worked with the Washington Archaeological Societies when he's a teenager. He actually excavated these beater boast basket that Ed Carrier and I are replicating and written up in our book. But this is a basket he excavated and how it's been replicated. And he's visiting and telling Ed his experience at excavating these baskets in the early 60s. So we'll surely miss David and his help through the years. Good news, Ed Carrier and I just recently on the science side got the Society for American Archaeologists Award for Excellence in Archaeological Analysis. Our approach is generationally linked archaeology, and he partly got that from actually working with these archaeological baskets that are thousands of years old, not tens, but thousands of years old, and linking through the generations my statistics, his work to the deep past. he recently got this National Endowment for the Humanities Award, the highest award you can get with our country. And he took his 3 great grandkids. This is the youngest one wearing the medal that he got at the ceremony about 3 weeks ago. So it was a big family affair. I'm gonna try to show you a real quick presentation by Ed on if I can get to it. Maybe I'm not. Doesn't look like I have it anymore. No, is that it? Anyway, some of you got that that link. I'm afraid I'm not going to show it unless Matt can get it. But anyhow, we're very lucky to, let me get back to the slideshow here, to be able to have, is this the, yeah, this presentation tonight by Loren Davis, and it certainly is showing that stem points appear to be prior to Clovis points. The Clovis first idea is no longer holding at all, and this is site stem points he's seeing as early as over 16,000 years ago. I'm very impressed by his site. This is a very clean and well organized looking project, and here are the stem points that he's been finding. Here he's holding one here, and he just was featured in the spring issue of American Archaeology, finding the oldest points in Idaho, and adding to a growing, certainly, body of evidence that people settled in North America long before Clovis sites. And this certainly indicates it. Here's his site. Here's our Chehalis River idea of people coming in. Let me see if I can get. Anyway, you can see my arrow, but people coming in this direction, if they did, they eventually would have found their way down probably into the Columbia River, and but this would be your first place after the glaciation. This area actually be pretty glaciated, where you could get into the second Earth, the whole Americas here, and eventually work your way over into areas like Cooper's Ferry. Like I was telling Loren, we have some ice dams, some flooding, but nothing like the Missoula floods that would have cleaned the slate of a lot of slides as they came roaring through here and up the Willamette Valley. So we may have a chance of seeing things off the coast that were flooded with the rising sea level of sites in this area. And I don't think Patrick Pringle's here, but he's the one that's given talks on the floods that came through the Chehalis as well. This is where the site area is. I think that Dick and his wife are just in the area. And this thing. And these are the stem points in Carlson's illustration and compared to these fluted Clovis points, and that's shown in that magazine article as well. The winner talk will be the second part of our double hitter. Will be Patrick Grady, again from Oregon, but University of Oregon, on his recent work with this site at Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter, and he's found camel teeth, ancient camels, which actually originated in the New World and migrated into the Old World, and they're dating around 11,000 years ago, and also 18,000-year-old chalcedony flakes with blood residue from an extinct, a much bigger bison than we see in present day buffalo. So that'll be another part of this puzzle. And he did summer field school this summer, and I don't know if there was how much new that was found. And then late winter again will be myself and Ed on our latest work, we're coming together on a book on the first half of his life. He was raised by his great grandmother from infancy, and they pretty much had to live off the land. So he really wanted to do that. So it was really his idea to really look at how he shellfished, how he fished, how he hunted all kinds of ducks and certainly some deer and a little bear, and also sorry, this thing's going all over, but replicates a lot of these things like a gill net out of nettle fibers and things that we can relate to sites that are found within 20 miles of him, where we are looking at the fauna and the flora and seeing a lot of consistency for 4,000 years from what he did. Of course, he did it in a more modern age, but really the same resources that we can compare to sites for 4,000 years in Puget Sound, and see the continuity of what he was doing for that amount of time. The whole idea is basketry certainly does show the linkage and style from what he learned from his great grandmother back at least 4,000 years. So the idea is, well, this should also work with other cultural practices. And Ed really wanted to record all this, his practices of making a living off the land. And so that's essentially what we've been able to put together, and it really does show that generationally linked archaeology works with subsistence too, living off the land, as he calls it, of course, living off the land and water. Well, let's get started. And again, Loren has pointed out that he, I don't know why my clicker's having so much trouble, but Loren certainly said he got his degrees. First of all, his Bachelor of Science from the Oregon State University, and then a master's in science and anthropology and geography and soils from Oregon State University. Went on for his PhD at the University of Alberta, where a lot of people have been working on the peopling of the first America. And that's kind of been his focus. Like I say, the archaeology of the first peoples, his work with students has been very imaginative and creative in looking for mammoth remains that have been found in the Willamette Valley. We're doing something similar and dating them with some from museums, just to get an idea of the environment and the timing. And this work in Baja, California is pretty amazing, where they're finding a whole lot of ancient fish hooks. How many, 100 or quite a few of these?
We have 36 of them so far.
Yeah, 36, but from 11 plus thousand years ago, and anchor stones and other artifacts that are curious in terms of that. And then the fauna shows that some of these fish only are going to be found in deep sea. So these were very early people on the coast of the Pacific and deep sea fishing with hook and line. And he's director of the Pacific Slope. It's called Pacific Slope. So the whole Pacific Slope Archaeological Laboratory, working with students on his Cooper Ferry work, and he's also developing 3D scanning techniques to and approaches to analyze the stone tools, which are like with cache of these stone, these stem points, pretty amazing. I don't have, we should really get going. He's done over 67 that I could find professional papers and involved in books. And so with that, I thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing about your work and your ideas. Thank you, Loren.
Well, thank you very much, Dale. And thank you very much to the Society for inviting me to give a presentation here. And you guys have a lot of interesting things going on, it sounds like, and I put some things on my own calendar. I hope to come back and listen as well to some of your future speakers. But as mentioned, I'm going to talk about the Cooper's Ferry site today. So why don't we go ahead and I'm just going to jump into it. And I have to practice. We practiced earlier, so it's going to go black here just for a second, I think, but no worries. It'll come back. I have been working in the Cooper's Ferry at the Cooper's Ferry site since 1997. So I've been working there a long time, and it's a pretty important place for me, but also for, okay, I think we're going to get it. How's that look? Does that look good?
You need to swap displays.
I thought I just did that. Swap displays again. Does that look good?
Perfect.
Okay, great. I'll get it eventually. All right. So working here at the site has been an important part of my own career, and it gets more rewarding all the time because I just got back this afternoon, driving back from Idaho. I participated in the filming of a part of a documentary that's being put on by it's an Indigenous director out of Canada, and she is doing a large documentary about early sites in all of the Americas. So she'll be traveling, from Yukon all the way down to Chile and Monteverde and points in between to do this. And what's important about this new documentary, and it's called Leaving Beringia, and she says that it'll be done like in the spring or the summer of this next year. But what's important about this is she make sure that she has representation from Indigenous peoples at all points along the way. Because usually the story is dominated, of course, by non-Indigenous archaeologists who describe what's going on. But at least in the case of Cooper's Ferry, we were able to get elders and cultural program members of the Nez Perce tribe to be there on the site with me and with the film crew. And we had a lot of really great conversations and talked about what the record might mean. So some of the things that Dale was saying too about showing continuity between the archaeological record and ethno-historic and cultural knowledge. That's a theme too that's very important here at Cooper's Ferry. And that'll be a bit of an aspect that we'll talk about today. So let's go ahead and get started. So as the title says, we're going to talk about archaeological evidence of what we would call early peoples at the Cooper's Ferry site. The Nez Perce have a name for this place, and it's called Nipéhe, and it refers to a story about two children that appeared at the village that was at this place, and they had been orphaned due to a disaster in the canyon, either an avalanche or a landslide. It's not clear, but the site is known for this event, these two orphaned children showing up and being taken in by the village. So as you can see here in the first slide, it's in the Salmon River Canyon, which is adjacent to the Snake River Canyon, or where Hell's Canyon is. It's near where Oregon, Idaho, Washington come together. And it's a very dry place in the summer, although when I was just there yesterday, it was snowing. So it's a temperate place, that's for sure. Well, here's a reconstruction of what, based on a lot of information that I could gather from the literature, what our region may have looked like around 16,000 or so years ago. And as we heard, the Chehalis River is definitely a point of entry. There are, a number of points of entry along the way, but I encourage you to pursue your idea with the Chehalis River as a point of entry for people if they're coming down the coast, as we think that might be true. And as I would tell to my students, look for Dora, that is the dirt of the right age. So just find where that deposit exists in your landscape and then focus on where people would want to be in the landscape where that dirt is actually found. So that's a pretty basic idea, but that's a powerful one. And in this landscape here at 16,000 years, we can already see that, that concept of the dirt of the right age actually matters a lot, because if we have mega floods roaring through the landscape, that would have been a real problem for recording archaeological sites wherever mega floods, that is where the MF logo is. That's the course of the Missoula floods. And the Cooper's Ferry site shown here in the orange box is situated higher in elevation in the Columbia Basin than the mega floods. So we don't have any evidence that the mega floods ever got as high as Cooper's Ferry, but definitely people living there at this time would have had some awareness, I'm sure. And any social network that they had very likely was very disrupted at this time as well. So also to make ice, the size of the Cordilleran ice sheet and the Laurentide ice sheet, these big ice sheets that sit on northern part of North America, to make ice that size, you draw down the world's oceans. And these are concepts I'm sure that are familiar to you in the society here. And so Washington and Oregon both had much larger coastlines. So in Oregon, we had something like 35 extra miles to the west of coastline. So 16,000 years, some of the most attractive places to live are now areas that are underwater. So that makes it harder for us to find these sites on the coast. If you go up north to where Duncan McLaren, Quentin Mackey, Daryl Fedge, where those fellas work, they figured out ways to get towards sweet spots where you might be able to track pieces of the landscape that are not submerged. And so I always look forward to hearing more things about what's happening up in British Columbia. So as I mentioned, the Nez Perce, or the Nipéhe, as they refer to themselves, they refer to this place as an ancient village site. So I want to use that as a theme to think about this concept of, well, how do we measure things like this? When oral history is brought up and it's talked about how this place was the location of something like an ancient village. And it's one of the few places in the landscape where the Nez Perce consistently talk about that people lived here an extremely long time is part of their knowledge. And I would hear that story too before we even did the work that led to getting very early radiocarbon dates. So it isn't as if, of course, they're really influenced by the things that I find out. What I often find is archaeology is trying to catch up sometimes to what the traditional views are in this part of the world. So it's located at the mouth of this tributary canyon. And these tributary canyons are spaced out roughly about every 20 miles or so up and down the river. And but they're not really very regular. What controls them is large fault systems that run through the landscape. So we also see that very large ethnographic period villages are positioned at the mouths of these kinds of places. And it makes sense to me why that would happen. The river turns through here, and you get a lot of driftwood accumulating near the mouths of places like this. We had big gravel bars, and there probably was a similar version of this in the past. And when you do that, you have this convenience of having your firewood and your lumber yard right below you, and it gets replenished by the river all the time. So it's pretty nice. You don't have to walk to the top of the canyon to get firewood. And also you can think of this as an off-ramp off of the main corridor of the river. You can walk up these tributaries and access different kinds of ecologies. And so there's different foods and resources up these side canyons that you don't necessarily have on the main canyon. Traveled through this kind of landscape that's really rugged and deep was very commonly along ridge lines. And so here we have access to a pretty prominent ridge that people would have walked up and get moved around the canyon pretty easily. So I first started working at the site in 1997. I was just out of my done with my master's degree. I had started as a student at the University of Alberta for my doctoral program in 1995. And I had previously worked in this region for the Bureau of Land Management. So I was an archaeologist working for the federal government. My job was to go out and do survey and find archaeological sites and record them and get them on the federal registry of sites. And I was just in heaven, in my 20s, doing this kind of work, getting paid to go hiking in this beautiful landscape and find sites. I just couldn't believe my luck. And along the way, of course, I did a lot of reading and learning about the sites in the region. And Cooper's Ferry was one of these places that had been investigated in the 60s by an archaeologist out of Idaho named B. Robert Butler. And he had worked here in the 60s. And then later in the 70s, David Rice did a little bit of investigation here too. So other archaeologists had worked here before I dug this, as you see here in the picture, 2 meter by 2 meter pit in 1997. And my goal in doing this was to learn more about the things that people from the 60s and 70s were giving us these glimpses on. And in particular, we wanted to know what are the ages of these different layers that we can see here, because there's archaeology in every layer. But what we didn't know from the 60s is exactly what that was in terms of numerical time. B. Robert Butler had found stemmed projectile points. And, in the 60s and 70s, there was, you can read this in the literature, that there's a lot of questions that people have about sort of the relative place of where this stemmed point technology might sit in the whole sequence. Because while some Clovis fluted points have been found in the Northwest, I mean, it's nothing compared to other parts of the southern part of North America, especially the American Southeast and the East Coast, and the plains, where they have a lot of Clovis sites. Well, you probably know this too. We have yet to actually have buried, intact, radiocarbon dated Clovis sites show up in the Northwest so far. So I was very much hoping in working here we might be able to see that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So in 1997, we dug this, where essentially was like an elevator shaft down through the whole sequence, and we exposed this different layered sequence. And in the bottom part, there's a bit of a light tan deposit, and this is wind-blown glacial dust that we call loess. And this loess material accumulates very gently and gradually over time. And you can also see there's some weird shapes here, these polka dots and these kind of weird lobes. And these are the infilled traces of rodent burrows. And so rodents are burrowing down. They're going from one layer to another, sometimes down, sometimes up, and they're pushing around these different colored sediments. Well, as a result of that, of course, they can mix up the archaeological record badly. So we definitely wanted to make sure that we could excavate these separately from the sediments that don't look like this, as a way to control for what was disturbed and what was not disturbed. So by the time we got down toward the bottom of this, in the end of the summer in 1997, we were down in the windblown glacial dust. And in this next diagram, or next slide, you see here's a black and white photo that shows the windblown glacial dust, but we were starting to get rocks. So you can hopefully see my cursor moving around here. We had rocks poking out of the windblown glacial dust. As we got deeper, we had some gravels and things. So we get over here to photograph C. There's a pile of gravels here. We get a little bit lower, and this is a photograph taken every 10 centimeters, and you can see a circle. So there's a circle of darker sediment. As we got deeper, we got to a layer of gravels, and the gravels underlie the whole thing. And the circle kept going into the gravels, and it kept on going as we went deeper. And ultimately it bottomed out into the gravels. So really the way to imagine what's happening here is someone dug a cylinder starting in the windblown glacial dust and downward through the sand and the gravel below. And this shape that would have been something like a garbage can, sort of in shape, like you have at your house, people would put sediment back in it, and they also put artifacts like these. So these 4 stemmed spear points were found together, or dart points were found together in a pile. And then these other tools were found in the matrix of the fill as they put sediment back in the pit. And so here we have some blades, and these are blades that are made with a very particular technique that we see in the greater Northwest, including what I would consider British Columbia and Oregon, Idaho, Washington. And it's called a lavawa, or levawa, depending on your pronunciation. My French is not strong. So this approach is just a way to take very long flat flakes out of spheres, is sort of a way to think about it. And we have some small blades. We also have some flake tools, a hammerstone, a core made of local volcanic rock, probably basalt or andesite, and a couple of scraping tools. So I like to think of this as someone put the contents of their toolbox all together in this pit and buried it, and they put a pile of gravel on the top to mark it, maybe. But for whatever reason, They never came back and opened it up again. And we found it 13,200 years later. So I'm going to be talking mostly in calendar years, but I'll be clear about what I'm talking about. So the radiocarbon dates are about 11,410, 11,370. That is BP, but that translates to 13,200. So when this was published, after our discovery of it in 1997, at that time in the history of archaeology in the Americas, this was pretty controversial because that overlaps very much with the Clovis period, and these are definitely not Clovis points. So, we got a lot of criticism, and I was learning how to do this when I was beginning, and there was a lot of ways that I probably could have communicated things a little bit better, and also, sometimes it just takes a while to change minds, and I don't think Cooper's Ferry was necessarily something that has massively changed minds because it has been information that kind of the site has been being produced while a lot of other sites are being discovered too of this time period. So I think it's just sort of part of a larger theme of things that's happening in the history of archaeology. So after I was done with my PhD, I worked for a few years and eventually got a job at Oregon State University in 2004. And by 2009, I had worked with the Bureau of Land Management and the BLM. My representative or my archaeological partner that works at the Bureau of Land Management, his name's David Sisson. And David Sisson works out of the Cottonwood office in Idaho. And he began conversations with the Nez Perce about the idea of doing more excavation here, because David and I had talked, wouldn't it be great if now that I have a job at a university and I can get grants and things like this, perhaps, we could expand on some of the things that we had done in 1997 in order to learn more, because there were a lot of questions, even though we had found some interesting things. And in particular, what we were keen to know more about was more details about the lives of people at the past at the site. And it wasn't enough just to say people were here at a certain time and they made a certain kind of artifact. We wanted to know more about as rich details as we could about their lives. So that meant that we wanted to excavate much larger areas. And we refer to these as Area A and Area B. And before 2009, David had been in conversations with the Nez Perce tribe and reached consensus between myself and him and the tribal council of Nez Perce. And we received a letter from them in support saying that they thought that continued work here would be beneficial to the tribe, and they look forward to learning more about the deep past through the work that we might do together. So from 2009 to 2018, I directed excavation here at the Cooper's Ferry site. And if you know where to look on Google Earth, as you see here, you can actually find this photograph. A little plane flew over and took a shot of us one summer while we were working there. And that's kind of fun to see. So Area A is the more downstream end and Area B is the more upstream end. And we'll talk about both areas. So from 2009 to 2018, we worked in Area A. And this is what it looked like underneath that black shelter that I showed you. And if you've never been to the Salmon River Canyon or Hell's Canyon in the summer, you're missing a real treat. So if you like saunas and things like that, it's a great place to go because it's extremely hot. So on a day like this, it could get up to about 114 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade here. And so outdoors, of course, it's probably 120 or so. And it also, putting this shade up was important, not just for, worker safety and health, but also it was a way for us to try to control the light so we could kind of see what's going on. So we have this sort of larger block excavation going, and overhead, there's this horizontal pole. You can kind of see this here, and there's a GoPro camera attached here. And we actually have the camera taking a photograph every 10 seconds. And I have thousands and thousands of photographs that we've got to process and put into a sequence, and we'll be able to do a time lapse movie of not just 2018, but many years before that too. And that'll be a way for us to kind of show the record of what went on here at the site. I ran this project, I should also mention, as part of Oregon State University's Archaeology Field School. So we had students come and work with us from all over the United States and sometimes from Canada also. And they would come and learn how to do excavations with us in this large block format. And They learned some geoarchaeology and got a lot of really great hands-on experiences, that's for sure. Well, the things that we find here at the site are pretty special. We don't just find stone tools, for example, but I should say that compared to sites like Paisley Caves or even wet sites in British Columbia, we don't find a lot of, or wet sites in Washington like Ozette, we don't find good organic preservation, but we have found a lot of features. And so here's a pit feature. This is the first pit feature we ever found. In fact, this was exposed in the wall in 1997 when I worked there as a graduate student. And radiocarbon dating suggests that it's probably about 9,500 calendar years ago. And here you can see, compared to the sediments next to it, it's pretty contrasting. And there's sort of a mixed up sort of deposits. It's really not so layered, even though it's been kind of traced as if it's really layered inside. But usually we refer to the contents of these pit features as, we would say that dirt has STDs, swirly, twirly dirt is how we would say it. So swirly, twirly dirt, it should look like a calico cat usually, because that is the result of people digging a hole and then putting the sediment back in and mixing up different layers together. And then whatever was in here might have had some organic material, which is maybe why it's a little dark, but that can sometimes be attractive to rodents. They'll burrow down into that stuff too. So other kinds of features that we would find here at the site included, these are pretty classic. This is a classic example of what I think a hearth would look like at the site. And this polygon on the top here is really ashy sediment. It's full of wood ash and it has a lot of burned bone in it, some pieces of charcoal. It also had fire affected pieces of stone tool debitage and stone tools. And as we removed this ashy material, we wanted to kind of see what the shape of the ground was underneath. So I would just tell the students, take the ashy stuff off of whatever's underneath it. And underneath, we would have a layer of this very, oxidized orange surface. So you apply heat to any sediment that has a reasonable amount of iron content in it with some moisture, you'll get this red oxidation. So it's just sort of like a really low grade ceramic almost. This one on the right is typically how hearths will appear at the Cooper's Ferry site. It's pretty rare for us to see them expressed with the total content inside them. And largely that's because some of these deposits, like this brown layer one, are created by water. And so as the Salmon River would flood and go over the banks, it would wash away things like this. It might float away charcoal and wash away ash. And we would get these more hardened surfaces left behind sometimes. So this one in particular dates to about 10,000 Cal BP or 10,000 years ago. So this is what the wall looked like at the end of our excavation in 2018. But here you can see the stratigraphic sequence here. And in particular, what I want to talk about next is the early record. And this record is contained down here in the bottom. And there's a buried soil. And so there's what's called a rubified weak A horizon. And what this means is there's a little bit of oxidation happening here. And that's because of just simply weathering from climate and plants and insects and rain and things like this, or temperatures affecting the surface and starting to turn it into a soil. And it's dry enough in the past that we're getting evaporation of soil water, and it's leaving behind what we call a calcic B horizon. So you get this sort of white hazy part down here. And below this, we get into the unaltered loess parent material. That is the stuff that the soil is made out of is down here. So the earliest part of the record in Area A is contained in this lower soil that we call the Rock Creek Paleosol, or it's an ancient soil called the Rock Creek soil. So I'm going to show you next just sort of more of a cartoon-like diagram of what we're finding inside there. So this diagram shows you a sequence of that wall that I just showed you before, but it has a series of radiocarbon ages. And in particular, we'll just focus on this lower part. So layer 3, which is that windblown dust with the soil in it, has a lot of pits in it. So this one pit feature I showed you before, this is the one from 1997 that had these spear points. We have some other pits that go into the surface, but as we were excavating, we couldn't find the tops of them. That is, I wasn't entirely certain that these had actually begun at this level, and I suspect that they begin from the layer above. Anytime you're going to dig a pit at a site, you have to run the risk of penetrating down, of course, into older deposits. And I think that's the case here because we have a mix of ages from 9,900 to 13,000. That doesn't quite make sense here, but that's probably because they just dug into older deposits, or rodents are pushing things up into pits. We also found two bases of stemmed points in this layer 3 here, and this one is the deepest one we found in area A. Below this, we actually had some other pits that we could see the tops of them, and they extended down in here, and there was a little bit of bone in here that returned an age of 11,720 radiocarbon years, and it translates to this age range. Another thing too I learned by doing some of this is that archaeologists love to talk about time in terms of one single age. And here on this diagram, I'm guilty of doing that here too. We talk about 13,600, but to be more accurate, what's important is to remember that that age range is a statistical approximation that says within this range, there are many different possible solutions for what is the timing of this. So I'm more and more trending toward trying to report these things as an age range. And when we talk about white sands, we'll talk about why that's kind of important. So as we got deeper in this, we actually found what I think is a hearth down in here. And so we again had ashy sediment. We had chunks of charcoal, fire, burned ground. We had pieces of burned bone in an oval kind of shape. And it returned ages that were really pretty consistent with each other. And then we also had a weird sort of shallow pit with that was kind of broad with a deeper hole in the middle. And this one is important, and we'll get to this one in a second. So radiocarbon dating showed that people had lived at the site. As layer 3 shows us in area A, people had lived here from about 16,000 years to 13,000 years ago. So our lower ages, and this is the position of it here, gets us to almost 16,000. And there was material below the position of this radiocarbon age. So down here, as we got deeper, we had other pieces of debitage and a couple flake tools, but we didn't have anything to date down here. So we used a statistical technique that made a forecast of, or a backcast, I guess you might think of it. It made a prediction about what the age should be down here, given all the ages of the things above it. And so we would begin up here, like this layer 6, there are 94 radiocarbon dates from layer 6 that span this time period of roughly almost 9,000 years to 10,200. So that's pretty well dated up here. And then it gets sequentially, sort of older, and then it gets older and older and older. So by the time you get to the bottom, the statistical approach can make a guess about this. And it suggested it should be a little bit older, getting close to 16,500. Well, we published that in 2019 as part of our discussion of this early record. And of course, as is, I think, fair enough, people are very skeptical of that. They're like, well, we'd really like to see actual ages on things down here. We would also like to see some features. And while you're at it, we'd also like to see a bunch of, farm tools. So the skeptics gave us sort of a list of things that they wanted to see. And we'll get back to how we answered them in a second. So from about 13,200 to 13,600, people were creating these kinds of projectile points. And to say that they're stemmed points is important, because what you're really saying is that the peoples that were living here at the site were sharing sort of a common set of design aspects in their minds, and they were transmitting it through the generations. So they were handing this knowledge down, and people were, replicating these shapes over and over. And I'll show you a lot of other examples of these to kind of illustrate this, but the stemmed point style is the one that is the most dominant at Cooper's Ferry through time. And if you want to move beyond the Cooper's Ferry site and just look at the archaeological record of, let's say, the world. So we think about, what does the earliest projectile point look like on our planet? When did people start making them? How did they first appear? Well, the first ones really sort of look like people are just attaching sort of sharp flakes or blade-like flakes to sticks. And eventually people start putting a lot more care and attention into shaping the way that they're hafted, that is this lower part. And then later on, after I'd say about 30,000 years ago or so, in Northeast Asia, at least in our neck of the woods, people start to really shape the blade part a lot more carefully and make a bifacial blade tip. Well, so if you had to pick one projectile point that was sort of like representative of the human species, stemmed points are it. And I know that people sometimes want to put a lot of emphasis on other things like fluted points. Well, remember, Clovis fluted technology, as spectacular and amazing as it kind of is, it's a pretty short-lived experience in the archaeological record. So Clovis proper really only exists, I think, for on the scale of centuries. So it doesn't really exist a long time. At Cooper's Ferry, stem point technology exists for thousands of years. Okay, in this unusual shaped pit, we also found some large bone pieces, and also we found a tooth fragment that went to an extinct horse. And this dates to around 14,500. And we think that if we were able to identify these large pieces of bone, they would very likely also be horse. Some of them, all of them lack identifiable features on them. They're a little weathered, so they're kind of hard to see exactly what parts of the animal they would be, other than to say it's probably from like a large limb bone or something. But and so here's an example of, this is what the tooth fragment looked like. And this is just an example of what people think that these Pleistocene horses may have looked like also. And beyond the Pleistocene, you get much deeper in time in the past, in the geological past, there are really spectacular horse fossil localities in southern Idaho. If you've ever been there, you may have been to the Hagerman fossil beds, but there's a lot of horses in the deep geological past. But these horses went extinct at the end of the last ice age in the Americas. And there's a very notable site in Alberta called Wally's Beach. And Wally's Beach has evidence of horses very likely being killed and butchered there as well by people. So people were interacting with horses. I think they have horse also at Paisley Caves, if I'm not remembering wrong. But this is a very early example too. And what's really kind of cool for us is it's the first example we've ever seen in the Salmon River Canyon that puts interaction. I think you can interpret this as interaction with extinct fauna. So moving on to Area B. So as I said before, Area A set up sort of this situation when we published our paper in Science Magazine in 2019. We said that people were likely at the site, as evidenced by the things we found in Area A, extending back as early as 16,000, if not maybe a little bit more. And the critics wanted to see, well, we'd like to see more artifacts, and we'd like to see features like pits or hearths or something like that. And we'd also like to see a lot of, even said, we'd like to see projectile points and stuff like that. It's hard enough to do this work sometimes without having to put pressure on yourself about expectations of what you should find. I just sort of like to go with the flow and be prepared, do your best and be prepared for whatever is going to be found. But it'll be interesting to come back to what the critics wanted to say. Okay, so moving on, we also worked in Area B, and this is what it looks like under the shelter at Area B. And here we worked for a little bit shorter time, and we had to open up a pretty big area because we ended up getting down almost to 4 meters deep below the surface, and we just didn't want any danger of collapsing walls. So we opened it up and we're able to manage it better. So after opening a 12 by 12 meter square and having to step in, you still end up with a smaller unit, of course, in the bottom. So here's an example of the wall that these students are sort of working near. When we finished our excavation, we had removed this bench and we were able to create a common profile. And as a result, we found some pit features. So Sarah right here is working on, I think, on this pit, 111, and then 110 is actually showing up right here. Or actually, I might have it backwards. I think this is Willa. Willa is working on 111 and Sandra is working on 110. And there's this unusual rock poking up out of the top, and you can see it kind of right here. It's poking up. So these pits were dug downward from a surface. So we can actually see the tops of them sometimes with these rock accumulations or markers like cairns, I imagine, at the surface. And as we excavated them, we could get radiocarbon ages out and figure out how old they are. So a lot of pits are made over in Area B. In fact, it's the highest density of pit features that we find. And in addition to getting things for radiocarbon dating and figuring out how they fit in the stratigraphy, we also would work to be very careful in mapping in everything about the size of a dime or bigger in the floor as we were working. So here is an example of feature 110. This is looking into the wall as if you had X-ray goggles on, and you could see the position of all these different materials. So the blue dots are flakes of debitage, and we have some projectile points. So here there's these red triangles are projectile points. So there's a lot of different things. And you can also see there are some patterns, I think, of probably how it was filled up. So if someone digs the hole, and then they begin to put sediment back in, and they put some items in together, and then more sediment gets added and more items get put together. So this pit in particular was quite interesting, and it ended up producing a projectile point here that Sandra is holding in her hand, made from local fine-grained volcanic rock. And as we were excavating, we found more points in this pit feature, and notice too that this is really still in great shape. So why would you put it in the ground? That seemed a little mysterious. Well, it wasn't the only one. In fact, there was a number of them that got put in the ground, and we would sometimes find a blade portion, and we dig a little bit more and find the base, and they would refit back together. And so someone's putting these in the ground on purpose, and they're doing it at this time period between 11,350 to 11,220 calendar years ago. And this was a kind of an unusual situation. Well, in addition to finding things like stemmed points put in the ground, we would also see pieces of animals from the local environment. So this is a wolverine, piece of wolverine mandible, and it was dates to the same time period. Wolverines show up. Well, hang on, I'll get to that in a second. We also found this, and this was a mandible of a canid. And now, if you're not aware what I mean by when I say a canid, what I'm saying is that it's a dog, wolf, coyote, jackal, or fox. We're being vague, but we attempted to have DNA run on this, and this large canine, for example, must have had some cracks in it that caused the organic content of this to get compromised. We couldn't get any DNA out of this. Well, we can still maybe keep trying with other ones, but we also did some metric measurements of these, and what we see is that if you go on that approach, which, canids have been studied in archaeological sites in the Americas for a long time, and there's sort of an argument that gets made based on the size of the teeth and their spacing and so on, the geometry, sorry. And this one classifies out as being smaller than a wolf and bigger than a coyote. And so typically when you get those kinds of measurements, people will make the argument that, oh, this is likely a dog. Well, when I talk to my Nez Perce colleagues, I mean, that's not a big surprise to them because they've had dogs a long time in their society. And they had two kinds of dogs, they said. They had a small dog and they had a really big dog. And the bigger dogs were, of course, like work dogs, and they would haul things around and you could load them up and do things like that. And I heard an interesting story that the Sahaptin, that is Nez Perce language word for horse, is a derivative of the Nez Perce word for the big dog. So they kind of thought of it as it's a big version of a dog, but it's a dog you can ride. It's a useful animal that carries things. That's sort of the root of the name of dogs and horses. So we don't know. And maybe this is a dog. It's not the earliest dog in the Americas, that's for sure. The earliest one that I know of comes from British Columbia. There was published some years ago by the team that Duncan McLaren's a part of. And if my memory serves me correctly, I think it was like 13,000 calendar years ago. If I'm wrong, I can be corrected. But truly amazing stuff, but I don't think it's a big surprise because the things we know about the genetics of dogs sort of go in parallel with things we understand about also people, that they share very similar genetic histories and they're likely have been together an extremely long time. So moving on to talking a little bit more about another feature, we have one that is nearby the other pits we were just talking about. We called it Feature 01, and it's one we found early on working here in 2012. And here it's the same kind of story where we do what's called a back plot. You can see the distribution of items as they were sort of vertically assembled in the pit. And we also found a stemmed point in here. And toward the bottom, we actually had found a number of fragments of bone. And so in this photograph, you can see the very bottom of the pit feature, and here's some long bone fragments and actually a piece of a mandible down here. And we took these fragments of the mandible and I 3D scanned them, and we reconstructed them as a complete 3D model, at least for the pieces that we had, and walked it over to Oregon State University's Fisheries and Wildlife Comparative Collection, and where they have hundreds of skeletons of animals from our region. And it turned out it was this animal. So again, another wolverine showing up in the site in a pit feature. And this one dates to, a little bit younger, 11,175 to 10,775. And so wolverines have shown up at least twice. I suspect there are more that we have at the site. We just haven't identified them as easy. And so why wolverines? Well, I don't think it's an issue of past environments so much. I think that what's going on is that today wolverines will come down from high elevations to the top of the canyon near the site. In fact, they're within 10 kilometers of the site in the wintertime. And they'll do this because their winter range basically tracks the snow, and the summer range also tracks the snow. So winter, they go down low elevation. Summertime, they go to high elevation, and they're just on the other side of the canyon up on top. So you could access them within a day's walk. So again, that's what this is saying. So not so far away. So I think that what this might be indicating is that these animals are showing up probably because they're being hunted nearby the Cooper's Ferry site in the wintertime. So you could think of this as a seasonality indicator. To try to get them in the summertime would be very difficult because they would be moving to these more purple areas in the diagram. There'd be a much longer walk to go get a wolverine and come back. So I wouldn't expect to find wolverine here in the summer at all. Okay, so we have some other pit features. And in particular, these are the oldest ones that we have at the site. So these are features 78, 108, and 151. And this is a view from above on the left and also from the right, I guess. But this is straight down, and you can see the distribution of items that we found all together inside these pits. And they were in pits dug into the loess at the bottom of the site here. So in this, on the right, you can see how the contrasting color inside the pit feature really shows up. And it was pretty easy to see them as we would dig. But as we dug through this, we also found that these pits contained projectile points, and they had radiocarbon dates that ranged in age at this earliest time period that we had in Area A. So remember, the critics wanted more evidence, lots more artifacts. They wanted projectile points if we could get them, and they definitely wanted to see features during this time period. So we delivered. And I was surprised. I really was amazed when these radiocarbon dates came back, how consistent they were. There's 7 ages that come back in this time range from bone. And we had those all run at the University of Oxford, or Oxford University, at the radiocarbon lab there. And they use what's considered to be the world's best pre-treatment techniques. That is, they sort of purify the part of the bone that you're going to get a radiocarbon date on. And as a result, the dates are considered about as good as we can do with the technology we have right now. And I think that they're really great dates, and they make sense in the larger stratigraphy also of the site. But before we talk about that, let's just look at these points real quick. So these are made on local materials. So all of these materials are easily found within that day's walk away from the site. And we have some fine-grained volcanics. There's 2 of them here. And then we have a lot of what are called cherts. And I think people know what these are, but these form within the local basalts. So they're not exotic at all. But this little guy, I really like this one. This one is spectacular. It literally fits on your thumbnail. And the base was ground. So someone took a rock and doled the edges of the haft, the base of the haft. And then also the blade had been pressure flaked at least once to resharpen it, I think. So this may have served as a functional tool. I asked my Nez Perce collaborators about this, and they commented, say, well, these kinds of things were made very in the late period too, a more historic period, as decorative items, or sometimes boys in particular were given scaled down versions of weapon systems to practice on. And so they said, well, maybe this is a boy's tool, perhaps. And I like to think about that. That's sort of my favorite interpretation here. That whatever the event was that contributed to people putting these things in the ground and burying them, there likely was children involved. And we don't really think so much about that in the archaeological record, but we have to remember that there were a lot of kids in the Pleistocene running around. So we should expect to see some kinds of signatures of them. Okay, and these two ones over here, one on the left in particular, this sort of yellow to brown one, this is the oldest one we have at the site, and it actually occurs stratigraphically below the position of these pits a little bit. And so I don't know exactly how early it is, but it's going to predate this a little, or I don't know what, maybe a lot, but it's some undetermined amount of time older, this one. So some of them are beat up, some of them are not so beat up, but yet they get put in the ground. It's an interesting problem. All right, so stratigraphically, Area B shows us a similar kind of record that we have in Area A. That is, the brown layer above is between 10 to 11,000 years. As we get deeper and deeper, it gets older and older. And what's different about Area B is there was a channel, I think, of the prior position of that creek that runs near the site. It ran at some time in the past, it actually ran near here. And so it laid down a lot more units than we normally see. And also we don't have as much in terms of artifacts over here distributed outside the pits. And there's a lot of pits over here. So it could be that this was sort of like the backyard of the village area or the occupation area. And people were digging pits to put these items in them, maybe just so they would be out of the way of their normal living space. But again, here's sort of how our sequence goes from the bottom up. Now, the red dashed lines are surfaces in the stratigraphic sequence. They show erosion. And so one thing that's notable about Cooper's Ferry is we often have these kinds of jumps in time where you have deposits down here that are close to 15,000 or 16,000, and then you go up a little bit and then it jumps to 11,000 or 12,000. So you're missing time. And so erosion, maybe the river flooded and chewed away the part of the site here, and we're just missing these deposits. Unfortunately, the window of time that we're missing also includes the time period that Clovis shows up in the Americas. And that's disappointing, because I would have liked to, if it is present here in the region or in Idaho in the Salmon River Canyon, if people were practicing that technology, I would have liked to have been able to see it at the site, but you can't get everything you want, of course. So, okay. So the Nez Perce referred to this as Nipéhe, as a winter village that was present at the site of what we call today the Cooper's Ferry site. And what is the evidence for this? So if we were thinking like archaeologists, we might go through a checklist, and check off some boxes. So the first I would want to see would be evidence of intensive activity. Like if you're really going to live here and you're literally talking about something on the scale of a village, that implies that you're staying in one place for probably months of time. And so what would that look like? Well, I would want to see a whole bunch of items, and we mapped in place in our 2 excavation blocks. And remember, we didn't excavate the whole site. We excavated something like 12% of the whole site, so that we think is the whole site. And so we found about 500,000 items, and a whole lot of features. We found over 100 cultural features at the site. We also should see evidence of equipment storage. And I feel like we have that on several occasions. Now, whether these truly represent, sort of storage lockers in the ground that people would want to store the tools in and come back and get them, I'm not sure. We did find some of those kinds of pits that did appear to have been emptied. So we would find the circle on the surface of this contrasting color sediment. You get very excited. We found another feature. You dig down inside it, and you would find the rocks that likely used to be at the surface, marking the top of the pit. And then there would be hardly anything inside the pit feature, just a bunch of, sort of disturbed, swirly, twirly dirt. So I think there is some cases to be made for people using these things as equipment storage facilities. We'd also probably want to find animals that go along with the winter. So we do have some winter range animals. Not that many animals are that easily put to the winter. We might look for migratory animals like waterfowl, perhaps, but most of the animals in the environment you might be able to access, from the site almost any time of year. But wolverine's a really good one for winter range. And also, I would expect to see houses. Now, I haven't talked about houses so far, but as I mentioned, we have very intensive activity with a lot of features. And I'm going to share with you some new things that we're working on right now. And I'm working in collaboration with people at the Nez Perce tribe too, to make sense of the things we're finding. But I want to just quickly show you some examples of if we were to find houses, this is maybe what we might expect them to look like. And there you can see a shaded drawing of a reconstruction of a semi-subterranean pit house with a wooden superstructure and a roof on top. And so, but archaeologically, we can look for places like the lower Snake River. So this is the Nipéhe site, which is in southeastern Washington. And in the 1960s and 1970s, and I'm sure you all are familiar with these things, David Rice, of course, did his classic dissertation on sites in this region. Also, one of my advisors, David Bronner, worked at the PNWAS site, which is near modern day Lewiston, Idaho. But they did open block or large open air block excavations, and they mapped as many things as they could in place. So we were trying to emulate this approach as a way to try to measure things at the scale of human life. So I took a sort of a page out of the playbook of the classic way to do this in the plateau in order to do our own work. So here's an aerial perspective of things that we're finding. And you notice that there's also a bit of a rim right here on the edge. They've seen a contrasting kind of stratigraphic contact. And so the inside of the house might be something like this. You might expect to see a concentration like this. And we also would expect to see a stratigraphic marker. So here, this is the view of the cross section of the house, and whoever lived here had dug a semi-subterranean foundation, cross-cutting through the stratigraphy, and the inside is what you might refer to as swirly, twirly dirt. So the inside of a house fill from the collapsing roof and all the other materials coming in would make it pretty messed up at the Nipéhe site. Okay, sometimes you also will see things like architectural features. So these are actually posts or the remnants of posts still stuck in the ground. Finding also sometimes charred beams. If the house caught on fire, that would really be something to find. I don't know why archaeologists don't wear these hats anymore, probably because they're just probably not that comfortable. I don't know if this was a sort of a theme that people were just getting into at this time or on this one project, but wearing a big hat's a good idea, but I've never really thought of these as being very, very comfortable to wear. So now let's look at the Cooper's Ferry site. We're back to the stratigraphy. I want to focus on the stratigraphic boundary between the bottom of layer 6 and the top of layer 5. And what's important about Cooper's Ferry is it more or less has a layer cake sequence of horizontally bedded deposits. And we train the students as we work there to get themselves in tune with what the sediment is like. So if you're excavating through layer 6, and you should understand how it looks, how it feels, how it sounds when you excavate, what kind of sound does the trowel make? You can really get into it, like how does it smell and things like this. But you should get really focused on this, because when it starts to not look like this, you should be able to pay attention and recognize it. So as this wall right here is looking north, we're going to now look at the wall on this side to the west and then to the south. We're going to rotate around and look. So taking that stratigraphy around the corner, layer 6 is still here, this brown one, layer 5. But you notice in the south wall, it all breaks down. And layer 6, it kind of seems like it intrudes into these other ones and it cross cuts them. And that's kind of strange. And then also too, we not only have a couple of these, which are probably burrows from rodents, but we have some vertical things that are very unusual. We don't have, Mission Impossible / Santa Claus rodents living at the site that are making vertical shafts and ascending, descending through these. Rodents want to kind of go on a gradient and make it easy on themselves. They don't really do it this way. So these are pretty strange. but there's a lot of disturbance over here. And if I was to mark the wall up and kind of annotate it in a stratigraphic way, I might, look at it something like this. And we had a rubify that is oxidized reddish feature over here. I think was a hearth. So I think that this is some kind of structure. And I'm saying it's a pit house, but it's some kind of definitely a big hole dug in the ground. And to dig the sediment, you typically will throw it out, and sometimes it creates a berm on the edges of the depression if you do that. And I think things like this could be posts. Now, again, this is a weird kind of slice through a larger feature that was present here. And on the other side, back to the north side, we not only had some circular features on top, this was that big fire pit I showed you earlier, but we also had some vertical things that I think are likely posts. And we referred to this one as the dirt carrot. That kind of looked like a very strange, or dirt icicle, sticking in the ground. So to annotate these, this is likely what we're looking at. So to take a little step back and look at the stratigraphy, in 1997, I dug a hole right here. So we cut through the middle of sort of this whole business that I was just showing you. And when I told the students to excavate through this brown layer, I'd say, get to the top of the gray layer and don't go deeper. I want to just have you take the brown off of the gray. And as they did this, they were finding gray everywhere. And of course, we knew about these features, but they said, well, this is hard over here. There's a whole bunch of other dark sediment here where everything else is already turned to gray. And what I realized is that we're likely looking at a larger depression that had some of the brown sediment inside it. So I think that we probably had, again, this was the wall I showed you and extended over to here. I think we had a large depression that was full of sediment. Well, as we worked here at the site through the years, as I mentioned, we tried to map everything about the size of a dime or bigger in place. And we wanted to do that because we wanted to use it as a very powerful data set to reconstruct what people were doing at the site. So we used a laser transit. And at one point we had 2 laser transits working in area A because we had so many items we were finding. And we mapped over 65,000 items in place at the site over the years we worked here. And I can then query elevational sequences of this data set and use it to reconstruct sort of a snapshot in time of what people were doing, at least as reflected in the items that were preserved and what gets left behind. And so I'm going to show you next what I think is happening in this area. And we're going to rotate the image in the next diagram. I'm going to show you, we're going to rotate it 180 degrees and be looking again back sort of with the north at the top of the screen. Instead of here, the south is at the top. Anyway, here we go. So here's that oval again, and here's the dark circles, are positions of things that kind of look like posts. And the dark sediment is infilled parts of dark sediment that should have been gray sand, but instead it's darker sediment in here. So we have a number of pieces of projectile points that are all stemmed in here. And the symbology of this is a little complicated, but we have the red diamonds are pieces of fire-cracked rock. So this feature was just loaded with fire-cracked rock. And there's also a lot of fire-cracked rock inside the boundaries of this sort of depression cut in the ground. And this was a hearth feature inside here that I showed you in the wall. So there's something going on with fire-cracked rock. I don't know if they're heating it up here or not, but they're definitely being used right here. This pit feature that would have been in the floor of this also contained quite a bit of fire-cracked rock. And also there are cores, there are scrapers, unifaces, there's cobble tools, there's all kinds of different kinds of flake tools in here. And there's a lot of pieces of bone, and there's a lot of debitage. There's another circular feature outside here that has a lot of material in it. We didn't actually excavate this one. This was part of a block that got left behind in 2019, yeah, or 18, sorry. But we have radiocarbon dates on mussel shell that come back in this age range. That is, 10,200 to 9,800. Now, you may have heard this, but in some parts of the interior Northwest, mussel shell is not a great thing to date because there is old carbon in the groundwater, for example, in the Snake River system. Well, we're above the Snake River elevationally in the Salmon River. So we are part of a different watershed and a different aquifer. And I was concerned about this because some of the ages that you can get on mussel shell from the Snake River system can make it look like it's 2,000 years or so older than it should be. And this is known as a reservoir effect. So I wanted to test whether a reservoir effect was active in the Salmon River Canyon. So we took shells from mussels that were living at the time of collection and took shell samples and sent them to a lab, and they got radiocarbon dates on them, and they all consistently came back modern. So there's no measurable radiocarbon reservoir effect in the mussels. So I feel pretty confident about these numbers dating this. And we also have charcoal that comes from the same feature at the same elevation as this, and it's a similar age. So we have another piece of charcoal that comes from a hearth inside here that is older. It's considerably older. It's like 800 radiocarbon years older, which translates to almost 1,000 calendar years older. And so this could be a piece of old wood. I would like to get more dates to be certain about this whole situation. But I think what's important to this is one of the oldest examples of, an archaeological measure of a house. Now, I want to say it that way because archaeologists sometimes have a tendency to say things about what peoples were doing in the past, indigenous peoples were doing, as if somehow, because I've found an early example, this must be the time they invented it. And I don't really think that's true. I think as early as people have been in the Americas, they have always been making houses, would be my expectation. It's just whether or not archaeology can catch up. That is, whether or not we can measure it. And that's an important thing to be clear about so that, we don't make, I think, tribal people feel like somehow it's not true unless we say it. So I often now think about what things that I'm told by Nez Perce people. I really take this stuff seriously and think about, well, could I measure that? And just because I haven't measured it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So you have to be kind of humble and honest about the archaeological record as well if you're going to do this. This is an interesting piece. This is a 3D model image of it, but it's a piece of soapstone that has a shaft that was drilled through it, and it's polished really nicely. This whole thing is shaped down. It almost looks like a flattened football. And then it broke, and I don't know if they were trying to re-drill another hole here or not, but maybe Duncan, maybe you can give me some ideas later if you've seen any things like this. I think I've seen images of these at the museum in Vancouver, they're later period things. But anyway, so moving on, this is what it looks like from, this is like a 20 centimeter vertical series of materials together, or like 15 centimeters, I can't remember. But this is a snapshot in time of things that were left behind, and also going along with certain features, which I just think is spectacular to talk about. And so what is this maybe looking like? Well, it could be that it looks like this. And I kind of hinted at this earlier, but this is a drawing that was made by geoarchaeologist Roald Fryxell in the 60s. And he drew this for B. Robert Butler as a way to illustrate what he thought was likely the reconstruction of the house at the double house site. The double house site is like less than a quarter mile away from Cooper's Ferry. And this house dates to less than 2,000 years old. And so I think it's not unlikely that the thing that we were just looking at could have looked like some version of something like this. And if that's true, then we're looking at a really, really amazing, incredible example of cultural continuity of traditional knowledge and traditional practices. And I don't have a problem with this whatsoever. Archaeologists sometimes really sort of have expectations that things should change and you should have sort of systematic modification of projectile points and things over time. But I don't think that has to be so. I think we just have to let the archaeological record tell us sometimes what's happening and not impose our own expectations on it so much. So for me, I think this is very exciting to be able to talk about archaeological measures of things that also reflect things that my Nez Perce collaborators are telling me, that this has been a very, very long-lived village. And I think it's just a beautiful thing when archaeology and traditional perspectives can come together and actually be telling the same story at the same time. So what does this all tell us? Well, I think the ancestors of Nez Perce peoples lived at the Nipéhe site repeatedly from at least 16,000 years ago. Now, remember, I cannot tell you when people first got to the Salmon River Canyon or when they first start creating an archaeological record. I don't know this because we run out of dirt at Cooper's Ferry. It's very likely it's earlier somewhere else, but I'm not sure what that would look like yet. If we dig downward below where we stopped, well, we get into this gravels that I showed you at the bottom, and the gravels don't have any archaeology in it. And if we keep going through the gravels, we get to like a 7 million year old basalt. So the record definitely ends at the gravels. And the presence of features containing tools and also reflecting intensive food processing. And I say this because we have thousands and thousands of pieces of large animal bone that are reduced down to splinters the size of your pinky fingernail. They're really, really intensively processing bone, probably to pull fat and make bone grease out of them. There's some seasonal animal remains. So I mentioned wolverines happening a couple times, and there's also large quantities of cultural material. These are all things that are pretty consistent with sort of high intensity resource acquisition, and the number of pits that we have too very likely could have also been used to store food. We're just not being able to measure it because of preservation. So thus the archaeological record, I think, shows us that village life at the Cooper's Ferry and the Nipéhe site extends back into the Ice Age period at about 16,000. So just because we didn't find houses that date to 16,000, I don't think means that they weren't there. It's just that they weren't in our sample frame, very likely. You know, wherever that was, wherever those houses might have been on the landscape, we either didn't measure them, or maybe they're of a type where they're not digging a foundation. You just make something that looks like a tent frame on top of the surface. Well, it just may not leave behind enough archaeological information for you to make an assessment that there was a house there. Archaeological evidence of early Nez Perce occupation or Nipéhe occupation may be present elsewhere at the site in places that we didn't excavate, or in the Salmon River Canyon earlier than 16,000 years ago. So I don't think the story of how early people were there has been really answered exactly yet. We can just tell you what we found so far. So for me, Nez Perce oral history and archaeological science tell very similar stories here. And I find that to be a very gratifying experience. I'm sure, you know, Dale would say the same thing. That as an archaeologist, to be able to kind of, I think, make things that make sense to the people that this record is about is a pretty rewarding part of my job. With that, I want to thank my research partners, which include the Nez Perce tribe, also the Bureau of Land Management. This is land that they manage, you know, as part of the public land system of the United States. And they provided not only logistical support, they provided administrative support. They helped to collaborate and make things happen with the tribe. And also they provided us with financial support on many occasions. And also the students of Oregon State University and the university itself were very supportive. I could not have done this work all on my own, of course, even though I'm the one talking about it. There were hundreds of people who worked together to make this whole thing happen, and I'm very thankful to all of them. So with that, I want to say many thanks to you for listening to this. Now, as I mentioned, I also have a shorter thing to talk about with Lake Otero. Would you like me, Dale, to just go from here, or do you want to have a bit of a pause? And if people want to jump off, they can and watch the video later. I don't think your mic is on, Dale.
Yeah, let's just keep going and then ask questions. I know you mentioned a number of times about the team from Canada that are working on some very exciting sites, and I do want to point out, and maybe we can get a perspective from Quentin Mackey, who works with Duncan and McLaren and Daryl Fedge on that very exciting work, see what he thinks. But let's finish White Sands, and then we'll go into questions. Thank you. Yeah, we have plenty of time, and we have 45 minutes if you want to take it. But thank you.
Okay,
ahead.
You bet.
In the slideshow?
Yep, I'll go from here. And yes, I'm happy to stick around and discuss and answer questions afterwards. So, okay, so let's go. All right, so I'm sure everyone has heard about the discovery of human footprints and what appear to be extinct animal megafauna footprints preserved in the muds at what's called Lake Otero. And this is in modern day New Mexico in the White Sands desert region. And so Lake Otero is just the name of the lake that used to be there at the end of the last glacial period. You know, when you have glaciation of the northern part of North America, it acts as sort of a mountain range, and it actually deflects a lot of the wet weather that we associate with the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia and Alaska. That wet weather gets pushed down into more southern latitudes, and a lot of these dry lake basins accumulate with water. And I'm sure a lot of you know this already. But the footprints from this place have been reportedly, described as being between 23,000 to 21,000 calendar years ago. So when this first came out in 2021, it was very exciting and it was wonderful to see. I mean, I'd heard that there were footprints out here in the lake. I'd heard this for years, and that there were megafauna footprints, but I had not heard about the dating. So that was a big surprise when it came out in Science Magazine 2021. After reading it, there were some things that myself and some of my colleagues had questions about. So we wrote a short paper. It's called a technical comment in Science Magazine, and we sent it in the next week, and it got published. And of course, what's important about this is that science only progresses as a way of knowing through critical exchange. And as people put ideas forward that are, let's say, controversial, or even might have huge implications, you obviously have to expect you're going to get questions that come back, and people want to know different things, or if they have disagreements, it's a place to, in a responsible, professional way, to discuss them. And that's what this was about. So what I'll get into that in a second, but let's review the rules real quick. And so the rules of how we determine whether anything is truly of an archaeological context, and if it's truly an age that people say it is, there's sort of four that we think about. And one is, you got to have objects of clear human origin. Are there artifacts, or in this case, they're not truly artifacts, but they're features in a sense that were created by people. So these footprints that are left behind are really, really good examples of this. And I had some questions about how these things are actually found and created, because I've never excavated these before, so I just didn't really understand how you could find them. So, and what I'm told is that as you step into the mud and you step off of the mud, the water that swashes back in, because it's moving quicker than the water was that the clay settled out of, you can get some coarser sediments that come in and create a contrast. So it's a bit like removing sand off of the clay, sort of that concept of one contrasting sediment off of another. So I guess they're not that, there's no creative license in here, I guess, is the idea. And I take their word for it, for sure. They're pretty amazing. So I think that you can check off number one. Two, provide good chronometric age determinations. That is, you have to have some kind of way to measure time in a numerical sense using a scientific method. And this is the part that we sort of argue about a little bit, that I'll get into. And so in this case, they use radiocarbon dating, and they're also using, more recently, a technique called optically stimulated luminescence that dates how long sand grains have been in the dark. And so we'll get into those things in a second. And just for the record, I don't think that the performance of the radiocarbon dating is an issue. And that's really not the problem at all. Although some of the comments I've heard later, people are kind of getting a little prickly about, how dare you question our expertise in radiocarbon dating, which is really not what we're doing at all. So, okay, so getting to the third one, showing clear association of the thing you're dating and the thing you say is related to people. That is your good association between the two things. And we can get into that in a second. Also, I think that's something that we should ask questions about. And the fourth, demonstrate consistent environmental context. That is, you're saying this happens at a certain time. What is the world like around them that you can measure in the record at that time? And does it make sense? Does it make sense for people to be walking around, for example, on what they claim to be a drying up lake at 23 to 21,000 years? Does that make sense? And okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So what these guys had done, if we review real quickly, is they dated these footprints initially by getting small, they're actually technically fruits, I guess, not just seeds, but they're fruits of rupia or ditch grass, and they accumulate in some of these lake basins, or they grow in these lake basins, but they are an aquatic plant. They're not a plant that respires CO2 from the atmosphere. They get their CO2 from the water. And as a result, they are known misreporters of their age. And what I mean by this is, it's a diagram from a paper I found where here are this green line are a series of varbs, and varbs are just small layers in a lake. And some lakes accumulate a layer every year, or sometimes 2 layers a year, like a dark and a light layer. So you can actually go back and count them like tree rings, and you can get an idea of how long time has progressed. And in this case, the scientists took rupia seeds or fruits out of each layer. And if they knew that it was, I don't know, like the 8,000th layer down, something down here, they have an expectation that that rupia should date to about 8,000 years radiocarbon time. But what they saw in this lake, and if you just simply Google rupia reservoir effect, those words, you'll find a number of papers that talk about this. And so rupia around the world can commonly show pretty dramatic offsets in time. So a VARD sequence is really straightforward. You just count the layers. Here, it shows that rupia is at least consistent in this one lake to about 6,000 years off. So that I had known about this. And as soon as I saw that they weren't accounting for this in their radiocarbon dating, I started talking to some of my other colleagues, and we thought, well, we should probably write a paper. So we wrote that technical response and said, hey, you need to think about this. It could be that you're overestimating the timing of your footprints. And the response that they get the last word in that science exchange, and they came back and said, well, that may be true for a lot of other lakes around the world, but this is a different lake in a different place. So, which I thought, well, that's kind of a strange argument. It's not special in that way usually in the planet Earth, but okay. Well, we really couldn't get past a yes, it is, no, it isn't kind of level discussion with that. So we started to think about, well, how could we evaluate this in a way that actually leveraged new data? We had to come up with a different way of testing this idea. So we wrote another paper that came out in 2022 in the journal Quaternary Research. And if you've read all these papers, you know the story, but that's the problem. A lot of people haven't read these because unless you work at a university, you may not have access to some of these journals. And maybe not so surprising, journalists don't really want to talk to you about you're maybe casting some negative perspectives on a spectacular thing that they really are excited about. So as a result, some of these things kind of fly under the radar. But what we did with this is we wanted to come up with a test of this idea that the footprints might have a reservoir effect associated with them. So what we did, and in fact, when we say I was a part of this paper, but as you can see, I'm on the tail end, but David Rohde came up with a great idea, and that was to get rupia seeds from a spring near the footprint site. And so there was an herbarium in New Mexico that had these samples, and he applied and got permission to get some, and they sent him some of these seeds, and they were collected in 1947. So the expectation, as you would imagine, what the age of the seed should be, well, there's no reservoir effect. They should be modern. So we sent the seeds to a lab for radiocarbon dating. And so the resulting age that we got was essentially how old the rupia plant said it was as a reporter of its own age in 1947. So the age was, if I had the drum roll effect, I would do it, but the age was about 7,400 years old. So that plant living in 1947 says, I'm 7,400 years old. So that was we already saw that's a problem. That's a big problem. And so to their credit, Jeff Pagati and the others in that team, were listening to this and reading this, and they thought, well, let's come up with another way to sort of address this issue. So we're going to do what they say is an independent age assessment or estimate. Now, the thing that's a problematic thing for me in this whole title is the word resolve, because this really doesn't, what we're going to talk about next, the issue is still not resolved. And I'll explain why in a second here. But they ran other radiocarbon ages, and they also, as I mentioned, used luminescence age dating. So let's get into why they think that this is resolved. So if you've read the main paper you may have seen this diagram, and I'm going to focus in on each one, so you don't need to squint. But this is the overall one where they provide, this is not an accurate technical drawing of exactly what the stratigraphy looks like, but this is sort of a representation of it. But what's notable is they have a whole bunch of new rupia ages and a whole bunch of pollen radiocarbon dates. And you can concentrate pollen and get radiocarbon ages on them, and they have luminescence ages. So let's go ahead and just focus in here. So we have pollen ages, we have rupia ages, and we have what they say is, and this is what they report in the main paper, which most people will read. There's a thing called a supplemental section that is only online. So if you actually have a subscription to Science Magazine, you don't get to see the supplemental. You have to go online to find it. So as a result, a lot of people don't read it, but that's where some of the most important stuff can be published. So the seed ages all come back kind of generally in this time period where they had before. And now pollen ages are coming back, and they say what they really like is they say the pollen ages confirm the seed ages. Now, but let's break that down. So what they mean when they say they date pollen is they actually took sediment samples out of here, and then they would go through a process where they could concentrate pollen down by using, chemical treatments that would remove other kinds of minerals. And then they would use different laboratory techniques that could sort small items by their, their density, their weight in different liquids. And as a result, you could concentrate pollen and get something like 50,000 to 75,000 pollen spores in one, little tiny sample. And then they could send that off to get it dated. But note here the age range here. So remember, we tend to think about the age as having the central age, but that's not really true. What the true age is the span. So 23.4 plus or minus, or 23,400 plus or minus 2,500. So that means it is greater than and less than this, which, not to put too fine a point on it, that error bar is half the size of the Holocene. So yeah, sure, you can say that confirms that, because why wouldn't it? It's such a huge inaccurate number. Why wouldn't it confirm it? So, and I think that word is not the correct one to use here. And also too, very large error bars here too. Okay, so, but the rupia age problem still exists. I mean, they haven't evaluated the whole concept of whether there's an offset or not. And I don't know how you would in the past, but I think what they try to do is say that, well, look, because these are kind of similar, or they think they're quite similar based on their median age, that there must not be a reservoir effect. And now by their own description, each of these sediments, the brown and white to brown and tan ones, are alluvial and aeolian, which in a lake basin, of course, or anywhere on planet Earth, when you hear the words aeolian and alluvial, it means redeposited. So all the particles in those sediments were moved from someplace else. I mean, that's how that system works. They're not created in this place, they're moved. Initially, they were saying that the rupia was growing here at the site, but David Rohde in our quaternary research paper breaks down how that's not possible. That's not the environment where rupia would ever live, in a shallow sort of stream environment. So these are all coming from somewhere else in the basin. And as a result, they could also be fossil, that is older ancient particles that were already existing in the landscape, got eroded and reworked. There's just no way of knowing that by the age themselves. It doesn't matter if they're consistent in age. They could be consistently from the same ancient fossil deposit that's being redeposited. And so we haven't had a chance to ask questions of the group in a format that's, like with the science technical comments. We did send a comment request in to science, and they told us that they don't do that anymore. And we were referred to their online story, and you scroll to the bottom, there's sort of a leave a comment little section like you might do on any web page. And we asked them, well, is that the same as like a paper that gets referenced and cited? And they go, nope, we're not doing that anymore. So I don't know. Science has really moved on. It's really strange. In the span of 2 years, they've made a big shift there. So regardless, we wanted to ask the question of by what process, because they didn't explain this in their paper, how did they separate out all the fossil pollen? That is, let's say a pollen grain that might be 30 or 40,000 years old. How did you separate that one out from the ones that were the same age as the footprints? And of course, it's a bit of a rhetorical question because the answer is, well, you can't do that. I mean, no one knows how to do that. And you're not dating individual pollen pieces. So as a result, this age, the error bar and uncertainty in this could be reflecting that there's a whole bunch of different ages happening here at the same time because it's a bunch of mishmash of different age pollen all put together. Okay, so moving on. Here are the ages again. I've just shown you their diagram and I added on the age ranges so you could see them, what exactly they are. And so really, really big span in time. And I highlight this at the bottom because whenever we use radiocarbon dates, we always have to ask the question, what are these radiocarbon dates telling us? Because remember, radiocarbon dating only tells you when the organic thing died. So it only tells us when that rupia plant gave up its fruit or when that tree gave up its pollen, in a sense, its end of life scenario. And as a result, it does not tell us when the pollen came to rest and got buried. We don't know that from the age of the radiocarbon dating. That's not what radiocarbon dating does. So in a way, this is not the right tool for this job. We need a different tool to actually address this issue. All right, so to deal with this and try to get another point of view, the authors used 3 optically stimulated luminescent samples. And here you see them in position. They've hammered them in. They don't have a scale here on this diagram. Maybe there is in the original, I can't remember, but I'm going to guess that these are something like 20 centimeters apart, let's say. So they're pretty close to each other. But here's the age ranges when you talk about the span of them. Now, in the main paper, they only report them as greater than 21,000. But more correctly, this is the actual age range, which I was kind of shocked to see that there's a different kind of representation of the timing. So this one could be anywhere between 16,200 to 19,800. This one could be between 18,400 and 22,600. This one could be this one. So, and what this also tells us is because this is a lower deposit and these things are above it, that all of these samples are simply younger than this set by some unknown amount of time. That's all we can really say about it. And if we say that this one could also be true, it means that all these footprints could be younger than 16.2, or they could be younger than 23 or something. But again, we don't know. This doesn't tell us down here the timing of this. And these are such a wide range. I mean, I don't know which one you choose. I'm not sure which one maybe if you want to be really conservative, you would say, well, you know, maybe this is the one because it's not like an OSL age is going to necessarily make younger ages. I guess you'd be conservative and maybe pick this one. I don't know. Okay, so this is a cutout of the stratigraphy that they have in their supplemental material. And so this is the actual diagram, and they sort of make a cartoon version, I think, of this kind of shape up in here on that what I was showing you before. But this is more what it looked like in the larger trench profile they created, which I found to be a lot more useful to understand. And the red lines are the trackway horizons, TH. So they have, I think, something like 7 trackways, or one is obscured here, but so they extend into these deposits and they're on the surfaces of this dark brown, lighter brown, tan, light tan. And I think what's notable is the trackways, and I'm only talking about things that they're publishing. So I can only try to understand this on the basis of what they tell us. But these trackways only extend onto these brown and tan ones. They don't go into the gray at all, apparently. Now, if I look at this diagram, I would also think that, well, these yellow ones, the OSL ages, are from a deposit that appears to underlie everything. And when I look back on their original 2021 paper, they affirm this. They actually say that the gray clay in the region that they studied is the lowest deposit, and it underlies all other layers. That's almost a verbatim quote of what they say. And so the surface also is quite irregular, and which makes me think it's some kind of probably erosion or disturbance of some type, for example. But what they would tell us is that these ages here actually date these trackways. They say that, and this scale is a little bit more than, I think, 2 meters, 2 over here or so. And more than 2 meters away, these 3 ages tell us the ages of trackway 1 and 2. They actually had said this through some of the reporters, and like they were hearing things that I was saying to reporters, and I think it was making them irritated. That is Jeff Pagati and Springer. I'm forgetting her first name for a second, but anyway, they said no. Loren Davis is confused. Those OSL ages are from in between trackway 1 and 2. Well, I'm looking at the diagram and I'm not quite sure I understand how that's true. And I thought, well, let's put a horizontal line on it. Well, the horizontal line doesn't quite go there, but okay, maybe it's between 2 and 3. But the problem is these 3 ages come from a deposit that stratigraphically underlies all the other ones. And what I mean by this, and a way you could do this as an exercise, is to consider the law of superposition. Within a sequence of layers of sedimentary rock, the oldest layer is at the base, and the layers are progressively younger with ascending order in the sequence. That is, the lowest one is oldest. All these are younger. And of course, I think everyone probably understands this generally, but they didn't actually put any numbers on their layers, which I think is kind of strange. That's typically how we might do it in archaeology stratigraphy. So I made this handy worksheet. If you want to do this for yourself, you can take a photo of this and put the numbers on there. I would come up with this solution, which isn't very radical. I think this is a first layer and this one is laid on top, and that. And of course, there's a lot going on off the edge of the screen here in their drawing that maybe we want to know, like, what is the relationship between these two? But if I'm taking them at their word that the gray layer underlies everything and it's the basal layer, then I assume that this one eventually goes down under. So this might have been some kind of channel, I guess, and maybe these are eroded in, and these are layers that got kind of laid in, and as they're at the edge of this clay bluff, this stuff slumping and collapsing into the water, I guess. I'm not sure. There's a lot of questions about what's going on here. So if we go back and get back to the rules, the objects of clear human origin, I think yes, there's definitely people here. And I think people need to remember, we can be critical about some of the details of this stuff, but we should keep in focus that this is a truly amazing, wonderful, it's a world heritage situation where you have this really amazing record of people in a place. You get to see things like adults and children walking together. I've seen presentations about people interacting even maybe with a sloth, so there's really, really cool things here that we can learn about people. That's not an issue. The chronometric age determination, I think the dates are pretty good. If I go back just for a second, the OSL ages are problematic. They use a technique where they actually do bulk dating of a lot of grains together, where today this technique is typically performed by individually dating sand grains. So not a whole bunch of sand grains together. You would measure the luminescent qualities of several or hundreds of individual sand grains. That way you could pick out, are there any weird signals? And then what is sort of the dominant signal? It's a better way to solve for time. That's not done well. But I think these other radiocarbon dates are fine. It's just that what the dates mean, that is a problem. And so clear association of dated objects and human objects, well, that's a problem. I mean, I'm not sure that the OSL ages directly date those footprints. I think they're just underneath them. And so consistent environmental context, a demonstration. Now, this is an interesting one, because if you look at the timing of what they say is a sequence of the lake here, they say that the lake reaches its peak before 23,000, and it's essentially desiccating and drying up at 23 to 21,000. Now, if that's true, Lake Otero is truly special, because none of the other pluvial lakes in the region have that same record. In fact, all of the other lakes around them in the American Southwest are full of water at this time, and they only begin to drain down to the level of similar to what we're talking about in Lake Otero, like sometime after like 18,000, 16,000 or so. So I think that there's some things that we may still learn here. And if we had to offer a solution to what maybe they should do next at this particular profile, I would say take luminescence samples from the deposits where these stars are, take them from the deposits that truly overlie the trackways. And that will tell us the burial times of each of the trackways. Now, you need to also use single grain analysis. And I have already heard sort of through the reporting that, there's some complaining that, well, it's very difficult to do. There's not a lot of quartz. It's so labor intensive. Well, I guess my answer to that is, well, science is hard, and it'll be worth it in the end. So, you know, you want to encourage people to do this kind of stuff because, if they're not going to do it, I imagine somebody else will probably want to do it. And if it were me doing this project, I would want to be the one that, figured it all out. So, okay. Whew. So that's it. That's it for the discussion of that. So I'm going to give up control here in a second. I'm getting out of the slideshow. Just any second. All right, here we go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, Loren, thank you very much. And I appreciate the last part as well. And really appreciate how you've been very responsive to the request to do this talk for our group.
Yep, anytime.
Quentin Mackey's here. He's probably very busy, but he's part of the team that you talked about in Canada that's been working on that. And I haven't heard what might it be some of the latest work. Quentin, would you mind chiming in on the talk and anything you might have to mention? There he is. How you doing, Quentin?
Hi, Dale.
Hi,
Loren.
Hello.
Well, I'm only becoming visible to note that I believe Duncan is here, and you should get it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah. Is Duncan Loren here?
Duncan McLaren, I believe that's Duncan that just says Duncan, but I could be wrong.
I don't think it is. There's a different Duncan. And I asked him, but he's a friend of Loren's.
Oh, is that right?
No, that's Duncan.
Yes.
That's Duncan McLaren.
Never mind. Hi,
Yeah, I'm here.
We got a good part of the team. We just Garrow.
You just got voluntold, I guess.
Oh, geez. Okay. Well, the footprints are. We're still waiting to see some Delta C13 results for any of the radiocarbon dates from White Sands. If I try to publish any dates on marine organisms, and I don't include that value, I'm not able to publish those dates. So I'm not sure why they can do that.
That's a really good question, and that has been brought up by other people too. And the reason why in this situation it's so, for everyone else listening, is so critical is it would reveal the presence of reservoir effect very likely.
Yeah, I haven't combed all their recent supplemental data, but I still haven't seen those values in any tables that they have. So it's kind of like pulling the wool over our eyes, and I'm not sure why the external reviewers of these papers aren't insisting on this. Cooper's Ferry, absolutely beautiful site, great place, and I'm jealous I never made it down. I'm just wondering what your future plans are, Loren. I know you've shut down excavations there.
So the landform that Cooper's Ferry sits on extends downriver because it's on a river terrace. And so this last summer, and actually the summer before, we were exploring the landform on the same side of the river, a mile downstream, to see if the similar kind of deposits are present. And we know that at least the top of the terrace is the same and the same age. And both of the terraces have a last deposition time of around 2,000 years. So we saw that, but we had to excavate down really deeply. So we're working on the edge of the terrace and we're about 6 meters below the surface. And this last summer, we found a layer that looks like the bottom of Cooper's Ferry, and we're just starting to get into it now. And we have ages that are in like 10,700 cal BP, so we're just starting to get into the Pleistocene now. And we found also a base of a stemmed point and some other debitage. So we've only seen just a little tiny window. We dug like 2 1 meter by 50 centimeter holes on the edge of a trench that we had used a machine to dig away the disturbed surface. But in this next part, what I really want to do is do this kind of project a little differently. And so we've really been hesitating to figure out the whole age of the sequence right off the bat. And we found enough that I think it's enticing. So then what we did is we went back and talked to the Nez Perce tribe about, let's develop a collaboration together. And actually, Duncan, some of this comes out of sort of encouragement that you had given me when I talked to you a little while ago about ways that you collaborate, in BC with First Nations peoples. And I thought, well, let's think of something that's more meaningful. And so I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we worked together with the tribe to actively try to find some of these missing windows of time that are very early, and also just to learn more about that time period, the deep history part. So I think that's what we're going to do next. We're going to actually try to look in this other landform to see if there's some of the windows I was talking about that are missing. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll find Clovis stuff, but I don't know. It'll be exciting nonetheless, especially to do it with the tribe.
I have a question.
Anything to add?
How do you protect the sites from looky-loos and weather between your working seasons?
Well, when we worked there at Cooper's Ferry, in some of the images you may have seen, there's some really black, look like big milk crates. And these are geotechnical, like sort of void management tools. So what you do is you build them out of these plastic panels, and they kind of end up being about the size of a straw bale. So almost like a meter by half a meter on a side. And they're made of this really rigid plastic, and we have thousands of them. And we fill the hole up with these like blocks. It's like putting sort of plastic blocks in the ground. And then we cover it with plastic sheeting and then with plywood. And then we bury it under like a meter to half a meter of dirt. And so once it's all packed together really tight, you can put a loaded log truck on top of it, and it won't collapse the plastic boxes. So, because we have to be able to cover it up every year, or like you say, people would mess with it, or what our big worry was, somebody would drive a truck into it in the middle of the night and hurt themselves and hurt the site. So, so we have to put it back to bed every year, which could be a major problem for us, but.
Okay, thank you.
Loren, you talk about David Rohde, and is he the same David Rohde that used to work up in the Northwest here on ancient plant materials from sites?
Well, Dr. Rohde got his PhD from the University of Washington, I believe. He works at the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada now.
He's good. Yeah, that's when I'm working with Ed Carrier on comparing how he made a living off the land with supporting his great grandmother. David Rohde did a site 1.5 miles from him, Old Man House, and particularly the plant materials. So when we're looking at berry seeds and what Ed stressed and other sites, he helped a lot with a number of sites up here. But I just want to point out what you're talking about is basically what Dick Doherty always emphasized, which is working in equal partnership. And he did that in the actually late 60s and 70s with the macaws. So that's found, just like you're saying, we really learn so much if we actually are equal partners and we both own the project. And so it sounds like that's what you're doing. Other questions? I just wanted to jump in there on David Rohde. Yeah.
Hey, this is Ryan.
Ryan?
Yeah, I've got a question for you. First off, thanks for taking the time to come and present. And I wanted to say, I really enjoyed the YouTube videos you did of Cooper's Ferry, kind of following the seasonal work. And it was really interesting and educational to see you guys go through that process. But the question I had is, I'm just curious, obviously there was a long period of time where you had consistent development of the lithic tools there at the site. Do you feel like you see lithic morphology changes between there and say Central Oregon near like Rimrock Draw? I have an interest in lithic tool development over time, and I'm just curious if you see significant morphological differences across the Western stem styles in that region.
Well, yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, there is change over time. It's just not super dramatic, but if you order everything in sequence, I think I kind of start to think about it as, that game you might play at a party, the telephone game where you say one thing goes around the circle. By the time you're at the end of that sequence of exchange, it's modified enough that it kind of is the same idea, but there's some variation. And then we also see that too with the production of stone tools. But remember, there's big gaps in our record. We have over 1,000 years of missing time and stuff like that. So, but this approach to making stem points is one that is, it's just a very successful common technological form. There's a book that was put out. I think I remember this right. It might have been Roy Carlson and Martin Magny did a book on projectile points from, I think from the Northwest, really. And that is with a capital N, including US and Canada together. And one of the things I was really hopeful in reading that was I was going to see, oh, wow, there's these really great, super specific time periods where this one stem point is really common and a narrow point of time, and then it changes. Yeah, read that book, because you'll be looking at that and going, wow, stem points seem to just be like variations on a theme for a long time. I'd be curious to hear what Quentin and Duncan think about this. I know Duncan's done a lot of work around Stave Lake with a lot of that kind of technology, but.
Thank you.
Yeah, we see in the Fraser Valley stem points of various forms over 12,000 years continuously. So it's not really very diagnostic in and of itself.
Yeah, that is, I think, a real similar way of putting it for Cooper's Ferry. I mean, in the sense that if you were hoping it was going to be a 200-year window like Clovis, forget it. So, and to say something too about your question about rimrock draw and comparison. I mean, I don't know. I don't really know much about rimrock draw. I mean, I'm curious to go listen in December, I think, is your presentation.
Right. You'll definitely be invited and part of our program now.
I'm just happy to be a student and listen, because there really isn't much that's been published out of that site. So we don't really know what's kind of happening, but I anticipate that must be something that Pat O'Grady's working on. So we'll see.
Other questions? Quentin Mackey. You're mute.
Yeah, sorry, techno peasant. I've got a question, Loren. You mentioned I think it was in your early season, maybe 97 or something, in your talk just now, that you'd found a little bit of this kind of pseudo Levallois reduction strategy. So I'm kind of asking on behalf of my student Allison, who's here from Ketchikan, and this could resolve some of the stem point thing, is if the rest of the reduction strategy, or if the approach to reducing cores was diagnostic in that early period, and if it included this kind of making of preferential flakes. And do you have any comment on that? Because I'm not sure I've seen that much come out of Cooper's Ferry yet on the debitage and reduction sequence, but I might have missed it.
No, you haven't missed it. That's definitely something that I'm looking forward to doing. And I did write a paper. It was a chapter, that was in a book about evolutionary convergence, and I sort of addressed I don't know if you saw that one, but I talked a little bit about that stuff. At least we talked about the sequence and where we find cores, and we actually have, off the top of my head, I want to say there's like 6 cores that I would say show this kind of approach to reduction. And then we have some flake products that are coming off that, what's a little frustrating, I'm sure you know this about this technique, is that it morphs between, discoidal and what people, I think, commonly refer to as multi-directional, which is, I think, it's such a catch-all concept. I don't know what that means when I read it sometimes, because Levallois technique is truly multi-directional. So I don't know what that means, but I think that when we finally get around to doing this, and I'm making a bigger push now to try to get to the finish line with doing these analyses for Cooper's Ferry. But that's definitely something I'm going to focus on, because we have enough pieces, I think, now that I can make a pretty strong case for what I think, at least, people at Cooper's Ferry were doing with this approach to reduction. What's interesting, though, is they tend to do this on rocks that are not that great. reduce,
Mhm.
you know, like
Yeah.
like metamorphic stuff and fine grained volcanics. And they don't seem to do a lot of it with the cherts. And so I don't know if that's just a way to, like, you know, if you got a lot of potatoes, you're going to eat a lot of potato salad or something. Like, you just have a lot of this kind of rock. So it's like, what's the best way to use this thing? We have tons of examples of, and we don't have to move so far away. But um, one of the best examples I do have, though, is made out of chert. And I may have shown you this one before, but it's illustrated, at least in that chapter. Now, in the pit feature we found 97, there is a really good, what I think is a flake. It's a product that on the top, it has centripetal reductions on the top, and then it has a high angle faceted, like a butt faceted platform, and its longitudinal cross section is super flat.
Yeah.
And so I think that one is one of our better examples of this particular reduction.
Yeah.
So now, you know, I went to a meeting and I got to meet Harold Dibble before he died. And I also was there with Steve Kuhn, and I showed him this whole concept. I just laid it all out saying, I think this is maybe what's going on. And I'm like, okay, now go ahead, like beat me up about this. What am I doing wrong? Am I got the terms or concepts wrong? And they just said, no, I mean, it seems reasonable. You know, it's not a surprise to them, I guess, that people might be using this in different times and places. What would probably have gotten me in trouble is if I was trying to make strong connections with one place or another in terms of transmission of the idea. But
Yeah.
because it does show up in Northeast Asia, it's just that it's much, much earlier, and it doesn't kind of continue on, you know, to a time period that would make sense as it coming over. So in my chapter, I specifically talked about that. I think it was an independent invention, but I could be wrong. You know, we really don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. I look forward to seeing more. Certainly, I think like in the collections that Allison is using, and I know she's got her hands up, but from Kilgigwai and a nearby site, Collison Bay and Haida Gwaii, there's quite a collection of the sort of preferential flakes, or, you know, as you described them, with centripetal flaking, and also sometimes a previous scar on top of that. So it's part of the picture that she's putting together, but she's got her hands up, so I'm gonna.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say this, and also this was for Allison and Duncan also. Let's make sure to let's talk about this now, but let's continue this offline too, because I have some ideas for ways I would like to share things that I've seen in advance of them even being published, if that would be helpful for you. So.
Yeah. Okay.
One thing, Quentin, about Haida Gwaii that you're working on, and is Loren's working on this Baja site that has deep sea fishing with 30-something deep sea fishing hooks, and you know and amazing. He's offered to give us a talk on the deep sea fishing in Baja.
Yeah. Cool.
So you have to be in an area where there are deep sea fishing in the work area of the Kilgigwai and so forth.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And Duncan had his hand up, but I don't see it now. Allison. Hi.
Still learning how to mute and unmute. Just wanted to hop on and say thank you, Loren, for your talk, and thanks, Quentin, for asking the questions that I was like trying to formulate and then frantically taking notes on. I would love to continue this conversation offline. And if you're willing to share, Loren, you know, as it sounds like you are, I'd love to see photos of the cores that you've got. And yeah, we've been thinking a lot about like the preferential flakes and how this really does or doesn't relate to this, like to Levallois. And as we've been awkwardly calling Levallois like for so long, and so trying to like drill down on what that really looks like, in the Northwest. So awesome. Thank you. And thanks, Quentin.
Yeah, I would love, and I'll just offer this here. I would love to share 3D models with you guys so you can just manipulate them and look at them on your own.
Yeah. And we've been modeling.
Or come on down and look at the collection, you know.
Yeah. That would be great. Okay. Yes. We'll continue this conversation.
Okay.
We've been doing some 3D modeling. I kind of feel like I've been doing 3D modeling, like the analysis I've been doing has been like 3D modeling for babies, but I think that we're coming up with some cool ideas from it. So yeah, this would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Allison. Duncan has his hand up again. Duncan?
I'm wondering a little bit, Lauren, about the faunal assemblage from Cooper's Ferry. And I gather that that's something that will be forthcoming. But one thing that I often come across in the literature for late Pleistocene sites in the Americas is cut marks on bone, and it seems like people are cutting bone everywhere in the middle of the shafts and all this kind of thing. But if you're setting out to butcher an animal, really the cut mark should be in a specific place, and maybe there'd be specific muscles that you'd want to release, and certainly cutting through the joints. And I'm just wondering, do you have many bones at Cooper's Ferry with cut marks on them?
Well, this is definitely something we're working into as a next sort of stage. I mean, the whole process of reporting on this has been like a reverse weird sequence where we're like eating the dessert first, we're going in the bottom and kind of talking about it back up. And then we have seen some cut marks definitely on some of the bone. And we even have some that are burned, like the canid mandible, for example. There's a lot of the cranial case is still preserved, and it was burned, and it was, there's examples we have example of a porcupine with skull where like the back of the brain case was smashed, and they probably extracted the brains out. And but also too, just finding cut marks on bone, is pretty common. The other problem we have though is so many of them are really small fragments that IDing them is a real challenge. And so I've started a conversation with the Nez Perce about doing zooms, analysis where we're looking at what kind of proteins these are. So again, for those of you who don't know, this is just a lab technique where you take a super small bit of bone, like a size of a grain of rice or smaller than that, like a grain of sand, and then they look at it under an instrument in the lab, and they can tell you likely what kind of animal it might have been based on its protein type. It's not the same as DNA at all. So don't think about it as DNA, but it's that. But you can, and it's relatively cheap. And so I don't know if you guys have this going on at Hakai yet. That and DNA analysis, sediment DNA. We I want to be first in line for being a customer when that happens at Hakai. So
Well, the DNA lab is up and running, but they aren't doing Zooms.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so it's coming. And I really look forward to what we'll find. And I was making a pitch to the tribe recently about, or members of the tribe, about think of all the extinct fauna we might find in these really early deposits that are only represented as small fragments. And wouldn't that be cool to think about, hunting of these animals as well? So, yeah.
Are they calcined bone, Lauren, or is it uncalcined?
Some of it is calcined. Again, for everybody else, it's burned. But a lot of it is not though. So, and maybe it was boiled or something, or not even boiled. I don't know. But some of it is definitely burned. Yeah.
Quick question. We have Mike Doherty here, who is quite involved with the Manus Mastodon site as a county leader. Did you find anything that looks like bone points, like they found with the rib at Manus?
No, we didn't find anything that I would say is a projectile point. We did find a really nice awl, like a leather perforator, or maybe even like for making matting or something, but basketry. But that wasn't very early. It was, merely 10,000 years old, Seems weird to say, but yeah, it was on the younger end of things. Yeah, bone just doesn't preserve super well at the site, and bone tools, yeah, they're really rare. I think that's just preservation, probably.
I don't know if Mike has anything to add. Is there, how about other questions? We need one or two.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
When are we going to have a presentation from our colleagues in BC about early stuff they're finding on the coast.
That's a good question, and I know they've promised me such, but let's ask it. Is Duncan here still? Yeah.
Yeah, Quentin, Duncan.
Brendan, how we doing for, we actually would be.
Well, still waiting for an invitation, Dale.
Oh, oh. He's waiting for an invitation, Dale. So here's your chance.
Oh, I invited you some time ago and you said, well, this is coming. So we're looking at spring. So think about it. And maybe, I don't know if you're going, I'll be going to New Orleans with Ed Carrier to talk about making a living off the land generationally. So we're doing a paper. So maybe we'll see you there, or Quentin or Loren for sure. Probably. But yeah, you're invited. You know, what do you want? A letter? I'll give you an email. But what do you think? We would love to
Yeah,
hear.
I could probably throw something together for you, Dale.
When? By spring?
Spring's good, yeah.
Yeah, we're kind of all doing that, trying to get everything done. But let's work on it, Quentin and Duncan, and maybe we can get Daryl involved. Other questions? That was a good question. Yeah. Okay. I was a graduate student with David Bronner. I think he's retired. What's he up to?
He's living in Portland, and he must be enjoying his retirement because I haven't heard from him in quite a while. So good for him.
Good job, a real good job. And I like the drawing by Roald Fricks. I was his RA before.
Oh my gosh! Wow, that's cool.
I think it's a good drawing. I think it's probably going to be more stone tooling mats for that area, but it looked like thatch or something.
I don't know.
Nez Perce thing. Yeah.
You know, one thing that we did was with these big features and pit features, we usually would keep all of the sediment out of the feature. And I have it in a warehouse. And I'm not exaggerating. I literally have tons of dirt from Cooper's Ferry that are in big bags from individual features. So we're going to be working in the next phase of getting this all done. We're going to work with a paleobotanist specialist and probably small animals, mammal or archaeologist or somebody to work all those details out from the features too. So that's all forthcoming. It's just a little overwhelming how much stuff we have. So
yeah, it's the pits are very impressive, and I think if you can get some botanical information, we did Sunken Village and found over 114, hemlock branch lined pits full of acorns.
Wow.
And so there's all kinds of plant foods that you might be able to find in those pits. I mean, those projectile points seem maybe secondary to what those pits. I'm sure they weren't using those pits just for caching artifacts.
No, I think there's some complex cultural activities going on there that we're going to explore that too. I've been in some excellent conversations recently with members of the tribe about that stuff. So you'll see. We'll see.
Camas. Do you see something that looks like Camas ovens?
No, nothing that I mean, other than the ones that are full of firecracked rock, maybe, but nothing we don't find like Camas bulbs burned and, you might see in later period sites, but it's just not that obvious.
Other comments or questions? Maybe Bob Berendorf would like to say something. Bob was originally involved in the East Wenatchee Clovis Point discovery. Bob has worked a lot in the high country. Given talks here.
Well, thank you, Dale. It's good to see you again, Loren. It's been a while since we spoke. All I want to say is this has been most informative in many ways. And thanks, Dale and PNWAS, for making this possible. And I'm going to be getting hold of you, Dale. I've got a couple questions, but this is my although I've spoken at PNWAS personally, and given a talk on alpine archaeology. This is the first time
Very good book. Very good book too.
yeah, well, these virtual meetings are great, and I look forward to future presentations. And Loren, I would love to be with you when you start looking downstream and beginning to search for equivalent landforms. I like your comment on really old dirt, looking for really old dirt. I like to think that oftentimes what we're looking for, another way of viewing that is, as archaeologists, we search for environments of preservation. That has geomorphic components, and sedimentological processes, and but I think we've far from discovering all of the important environments of preservation that preserve cultural remains. And so Dale's search along the Chehalis is one that's like that. So good luck on all of that, and I'll sure be watching. So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. Thank you. And if Bob is on your Chehalis hypothesis team, Dale, then you have a good head start already.
Yeah. We'll send you the paper. Vic's here. Vic's in, I don't know if you have a comment, Vic, on the talk. I should quickly point out that Bob was so excited, Marindorf, he emailed me yesterday, where's my invitation link? Which I had actually been sort of tied up with something else, so I appreciated the reminder. Vic, do you have anything to say on what you heard? And I'll send Loren our Chehalis hypothesis paper. Are you on? You have to unmute. I think he's there. He's from Arizona, so it's pretty late. Oh, we might have lost him. Well, anyway, yeah, we did. Okay, any other comments? I just want to very much thank Loren for being so receptive to working with us on this public education focused program, and thanks for joining us. I will be in touch as far as making sure you're there for some of the later talks, and I don't know, we might have Duncan starting and Quentin for the spring talk, so maybe we can get your Baja California next fall.
You bet. In no hurry. I want to hear from our colleagues to the north too, for sure.
Thank you. Well, I think we've gone long enough. It's about 9:30. So, but thank you again, and we'll see everybody next time. Any last comments? Wait.
Thank you.
Oh, Dick, you're just saying goodbye.
Yep, saying goodbye.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Dick, from East Wenatchee. And
Yeah, we're just about a quarter of a mile from the Clovis Point School where the Clovis Points were found.
right.
Okay, bye-bye.
And Bob didn't tell you the story, but he was the one that recognized that those points.